Hello, this is the video for Seminar 4, Module 2, and today we're going to be talking about social planning, and this short video is really just some of the summaries of some of the main points of that session. And I'm looking at the PowerPoints for Seminar 4, working with and developing communities with a focus on social planning. To start off, this video, we're just going to briefly look at where social or community planning fits in with those various typologies that we discussed last week. And remember that we looked at Rothman's typology, Popple's model, and also 12 Trees ideas, and just really briefly having a look again at those tables that you've already seen. So on slide 3, there's the table that summarises the 3 different areas that Rothman describes as different typologies: the community development, social planning, and social action. And social planning is focused in Rothman's typology as a particular focus on a problem and is task oriented, and usually it involves experts that can fix or can assist with dealing with that problem. And it's about gathering data, getting information about how to make decisions to move towards an action, an outcome that is going to deal with that issue. Usually it involves an expert, a researcher, a social policy worker, a project manager. When we have a look at slide 4, again, Popple's model of community work practice, remember this is just a table that someone has organised the different approaches to community work, pulled out the different aspects of those and named them in different ways. There's an overlap, as you can see already, with Rothman's typology, and in particular with Popple's model. Community education, for example, is looked at and discussed as a particular model approach to community work practice. However, community education can also and often is part of community development. And in Popple's model, social and community planning, again, is a particular area that looks at social conditions, how to set goals and priorities, and implement and evaluate a service or a program. And again, this overlaps with 12 Trees continuum in community work, which also looks at how community development can be one model of working with a community, and social planning can be another on that continuum. We're just revisiting those as part of a refresher from last week, but you can see that in different models, different ways of looking at community work, they all talk about social or community planning. And there are some things that overlap that are similarities with those. That usually in social planning, it involves looking at and I'm on slide 6 now, it involves looking at the needs, or looking at what's actually the issue here, what's the situation, and how to get information about that. Often a needs analysis is the way that that information is gathered, by getting evidence around that issue. And then usually once problems are identified, then there's a model that's developed, an approach that says this is how we're going to address this issue, these are the tasks that we're going to carry out, this is what we need to do next. And there's often a project manager or a facilitator, an enabler, a worker who has the role to help the community to follow through on those tasks. And evaluation is always a critical part of any social or community planning. With social planning, usually at the outset there is quite an awareness that there's going to be an end result. We're going to have a solution. We're going to have a plan about what we're going to do next. We're going to have a report. We're going to access funding. We're going to have better resources to address this issue. So it's very clearly coming to a point where there will be something at the end of the process, and it usually is a time-limited process as well. So just to recap there, the processes of social planning is that there's an issue or that there's a concern in the public arena, and that researchers looked into that issue, and there are different ways that that's done. Sometimes it might be a needs assessment. You'll be familiar with having heard that term and having read about it in the readings, but also in different community practice models, particularly in an asset-based community development approach. It might actually be mapping the resources of the community. So while an issue might be being examined, being looked at, rather than looking at what are the needs, what are the things that are missing, at that initial point also can be a mapping of what are the assets. So asset mapping is another way of looking at that problem or looking at that issue through a lens that shows what resources and what capacities that community or that group already have. Often at that point, it's this work is done by maybe a local council, local government, or a state or a federal government. This process is often funded for a very specific reason. Then there's a program developed to address how is that problem, how are those needs going to be responded to, what are we going to do about it, what are some of the solutions. Then people may be employed to deliver the project, so there can be another stage, and there's usually a very clear beginning and a middle and end of that project, and other types of community work are part of how that project would be delivered, and evaluation research is again part of that. Even though we talk about evaluation at the end, in any good planning process, evaluation is talked about right at the start. How are we going to evaluate this project? What are some of the questions we need to be asking now so that we know whether or not this project has been successful? Are we asking the right questions? There's one example that is on slide 9 of social planning, and in class when we spoke about this in Darwin, out of about 20 people, there were only 2 people living in Darwin, living in the Northern Territory in 2008, when the federal government instituted the Northern Territory Emergency Response, or the intervention as it is commonly known as, where the federal government overrode the territory government in this instance, and they also were able to disband, for the purposes of this intervention, the Racial Discrimination Act, when the federal government went into Aboriginal communities with a view to addressing concerns particularly around child sexual abuse. I'm making that sound quite simple, but there was a lot more to that, and it was highly political and also highly problematic in terms of communities' perception and knowledge about what was being done, about who was coming into their community and why. I guess it's an example of very much a top-down approach to an issue, that federal government intervened in the life of people living in remote communities in the Northern Territory, and it didn't happen in other parts of Australia. You can look it up and read more about it, but it was very much something that was impacted on by the current politics and by links to social policy, and at the same time people who were concerned living and working in Aboriginal communities had different views about the effectiveness, about the purpose of that intervention. A couple of examples that I just wanted to highlight, and I'm on slide 10 now, is a couple of examples of social planning, and one of those is a women's health service in Bendigo in central Victoria, and a group of women many years ago who were educators, social workers, social policy, members of the community, medical doctors. A lot of women felt that the health needs of women in the area were not being addressed adequately through the health system, and that if there was a service that specifically was run by women and run for women, that would better meet the needs of women. And a process was begun with a group of women who set out to really talk to women in rural areas and ask them what they needed, what were their issues, what things that they wanted information about. And from that process, greater forums were held, and a group that steered the project was successful in getting funding, state and federal funding, and was successful in forming a committee that then ran and managed Women's Health Service, which was called the Loddon Mallee Women's Health Service. That Women's Health Service is still running, and there's not many women's health services, particularly in Victoria, but it's one example of a social planning exercise that was undertaken particularly by a group of concerned people who identified an issue, in this case the health needs of women and how they could be better addressed, and by doing their research, by addressing the needs of the women in this large geographical area, and then sourcing funding, and then setting up an organisation to actually deliver that service. I'm on slide 11 now, and I just want to highlight these questions excuse me, as things that you might be wanting to think about when you're reading and looking at perhaps case studies, and when you're thinking yourself about social planning and what you might notice is happening when a good planning process is underway. There are questions that I want you to think about, and what might be some of the barriers to good social planning, what might be some of the things that get in the way, and what might be some of the challenges for the worker in the planning process. If we take a view of a definition of social planning according to one of Australia's researchers, Jim Ive, he talks about social planning as the process of the people of a community defining their needs and then working out what needs to happen next to have those needs met. I really like that definition because it brings the importance of social planning back to a community level, and social planning is a process that can be undertaken at a community level as well as at a higher level. Some of the things that you might notice that make it difficult perhaps to be involved in social planning can sometimes be external things, like a short funding cycle. For example, when the government perhaps has very short-term funding round and says we've got 6-month funding, here's funding for groups to go and conduct a planning process, and many people who work in communities would know that 6 months is not long enough to conduct a thorough and an effective engaging process around planning. So sometimes it's required for organisations or for workers to say we're not going to go ahead with that project because the funding is not adequate, we're not able to do it in that timeline. We need to say no, this is not enough. So that might be an example of one of the things that can be a barrier to good social planning. There's a couple of videos on YouTube that you can watch, and I will leave it there. Bye.